Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I hope you had a good coffee break and are energised and ready for the run into lunch. And we start with a fantastic kick-off to the next part of the conference. When TheCityUK was created, it was created in part to address the trust and reputations issues that had arisen in the industry after the global financial crisis. And that has always been central to our mission and continues to be so today. So I'm delighted to be able to welcome, as I trailed before we went off for our coffees, Carol McNaughton Nicholls, Associate Partner at BritainThinks, in conversation with Emma Reynolds, Managing Director, Public Affairs, Policy and Research at TheCityUK. Please welcome them to the stage.
Good morning, everybody. I'm about to lose my mic, so apologies. Can I get some assistance? No, I'm okay. Gosh, I used to be a politician, so I should know how to do these things. Good morning, everybody. It's such a great pleasure to see so many of you here in person. I just also wanted to welcome those who are joining us online. My name's Emma Reynolds. I'm the Managing Director of Public Affairs, Policy and Research at TheCityUK. And it's a great delight to be joined by Carol McNaughton Nicholls. BritainThinks, as you will all know, is one of the UK's leading market research agencies, in fact recognised as such as Agency of the Year recently. And we at TheCityUK have been working with BritainThinks for many, many years, and we'll be really interested to hear the research that BritainThinks did for us over the summer. But a word or two about trust and reputation that Miles mentioned in opening. So the TheCityUK's founding mission, in a way, really, was to improve the trust and reputation of the financial and related professional services industry, and it's central to everything that we do. We have it as a separate strategic priority, but I think it also connects to many of the other priorities that we have. In particular, our focus on the long-term competitiveness and attractiveness of the UK-based financial and related professional services industry, and our recently launched international strategy, which is all about ensuring that London and the UK regains that #1 spot ahead of New York. We always like competitors, don't we, in terms of the international financial centre that we have based here. So I see trust and reputation as being foundational to ensuring that the policy recommendations and the work that we do on behalf of our members lands well with those policymakers. And indeed, this time when we commissioned BritainThinks, we wanted to find out what the public thinks, and there was some public polling, but we wanted BritainThinks to focus on those political stakeholders, those policymakers who are making the decisions, because it's only if we have a good standing and reputation with those key people, whether it's ministers or MPs or regulators, that we will be able to improve the policy environment for our members, which I see as our central guiding mission. So, Carol, thank you so much for being with us. You have done work for us over the years with your team. We're really grateful. We're really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. I'm delighted to be in conversation with you, but I'm encouraging everybody in the room to be in conversation with you too, and online. So please do, once we've had a short discussion after your presentation, I'll open the floor up to questions. So Carol, over to you.
Great, thank you, Emma. Thank you to the TheCityUK for commissioning the research again this year. It wouldn't be a conference, I guess, without lots of PowerPoint slides with graphs, so that's where I come in now, and we'll be able to go through that with you. Emma has already introduced some of the research to you, but it is important to say we've been conducting research at TheCityUK since 2014, and in 2021 we repeated this via interviews, in-depth interviews. So these were kind of in-depth discussions and conversations with 20 parliamentarians and regulators. That's a relatively small sample, so I do need to, as a researcher, caveat that from the beginning, but it's quite a normal sample size with these types of audiences to gain that kind of real rich understanding of their views. We also did a public survey, a nationally representative survey of over 2,000 members of the public, and some of the value of this research comes from the fact that we were able to track sentiments over the years and ask some of the same questions, and I'll present some of the results from that this morning as well. So there's 4 key findings that I'd like to go through today. And I'll go through each of these in turn. And so I was just sort of signposting it to you there at the moment. But I think the first key point around reputation is that the industry is emerging from the pandemic in relatively good reputational health. But now is the pivotal moment moving forward. We've heard from some of the panelists already this morning about some of the challenges ahead and the fact that the industry has a really key role in stepping up to address some of those. And that's very much recognised amongst the policymakers that we spoke to as well. And they're looking to see what happens next. In terms of some evidence around the point that this is a relatively favourable reputational moment, we can see here, I did say there'd be graphs, we can see here in this graph, the dark green line is this year's, so it's the most recent years get greener. As you can see, there's almost a plateauing of favourability, or it's risen. So it's kind of at the highest it's been this year, in any of the years, either the same or it's risen, when it comes to favourability and trust amongst the public, to law firms, insurance providers. Interestingly, what we always see is that along here, my own bank, and my own bank always ranks much more highly in terms of favourability and trust. I think there's a really interesting point to make in that I do a lot of research with the public on their financial management. And as we've heard this morning, engagement can be a challenge. The average person on the street often doesn't really know anybody who works in finance. They don't really understand the industry. The conduit through which they actually have contact is through, for example, their bank and the products and services they engage with. So I think often the perceptions of the industry that we hear in research can come from popular culture, for example. It's not really coming from a place of informed knowledge of the industry. I think what's therefore really interesting, how their own bank and the entities to which people have contact with score so much more highly. I think it indicates that actually maybe the industry isn't doing too badly. There are obviously lots of other areas they can improve in, but there's some favourability and trust there coming through. Now, the policymakers that we interviewed, as I mentioned, are really looking to see what comes next. They acknowledge and recognise that the industry has taken steps to change since the financial crisis. They really do feel that the industry has been an excellent support mechanism in terms of helping to deliver the support needed through the pandemic. However, to the end point, as government support is ending, the industry is now facing that key reputational moment. So it's a little bit like snakes and ladders. You've gone up a ladder, and there may be future ladders ahead, and there certainly is some challenges to overcome, and hopefully some ladders to climb. But there could also be snakes, and things could go wrong again, and people are watching to see how the industry responds now. So that's point one. Point two is that both policymakers and the public credit the industry with driving a strong national economy. They have some disconnect in their overall perceptions between the public and policymakers, but what they do share is a really strong belief in the value of the industry in driving a strong economy and the role that it has to do so. And that's where the positive sentiment comes from. Now, I said there was some disconnect in their views. These two word clouds, on the one hand, we have the policymakers, the words we asked them spontaneously to use to describe the FRPS industry. And as you can see, successful, innovative, essential, some aspects of London centricity coming through, but all very fairly positive sentiments. On the other side, we have the public views. But as I say, I think some of these are mired in a lack of understanding of the industry and sort of popular culture. And so words like greedy and corrupt and untrustworthy comes through, but also money and profit. And it shows there's a disconnect in perceptions, but I think some of it is mired in things that we can also explain. Because the policymakers, I think, have a closer relationship and understanding. A really important point to make here today, I think, is the fact that policymakers in the interviews recognise the industry is UK-wide. And I know the City UK have been focusing on that in some of your messaging. And unprompted, when we discussed this, they could mention the fact they do understand there are hubs across the UK, that there's value across the UK. Having said that, there was also some concerns about continuing London centricity and attention also that the Square Mile is viewed as hugely successful. Nobody wants that to dissipate. And there was a point made this morning too about, it's not about competing with London. It's about ensuring that continues to thrive as the global hub it's recognised as, whilst also seeing how we can expand regionally. And so some of the suggestions for expansion included continuing to expand skilled job opportunities, having greater access to funding for SMEs and startups, and this related to keeping innovation in this country as well, and sometimes a sense that some successful businesses feel they have to go elsewhere. And finally, leveraging distinct regional and cultural strengths and really thinking about what is the value that different regions can bring and how can that be leveraged. And again, we've heard about that this morning in thinking about this area from the earlier panel. So that's 2 key points from this research. So the third key point was that despite the fact the public do recognise there is value in the industry in terms of how it can drive the economy, and I think it was something like 59%, for example, said that the industry really drives economic value. Despite this, they struggle to connect national level benefits back to themselves and their communities, and that is especially amongst those outside of London. So here's some more of the stats. As you can see in the green is the response here. So the value of the industry stands out to the public. The UK economy is coming out strongly, but the impact that the FRPS industry has on their local area and their own life is much lower. So there's a bit of a disconnect there in how they recognise the value it has for them, and also a sense that organisations care about the communities they work in. Again, showing kind of split of views there. So they don't connect those benefits that they do identify back necessarily to their own lives and own communities. And the point we made also about those in London were much more likely to agree that their local area benefits from the FRPS industry compared to those in other regions, as we can see from this graph here. So still some disconnect and still some difference across regions. But I think what's most striking is actually how similar some of these figures are across regions. There's a bit of a dip we often see in the devolved nations, for example, or in the north, but actually there isn't a huge amount of regional variation beyond looking at London there. So the fourth key point that I wanted to make is that whilst policymakers are more positive, you could say, well, if the public feel a little bit differently about the industry than policymakers, and policymakers are fairly positive, does it really matter at the moment what the public think? Because they're not necessarily an informed audience. I'd say it absolutely does matter what the public thinks. Because the other thing we learned from this research is that the public, their constituents, are the conduit through which MPs learn about issues, and they really care about those issues. So when they hear about one of their constituents struggling to access finance to expand their company, for example, or they hear about branch closures, or they hear about scams and frauds and other things like that that are concerns of their constituents, this is another level in which they hear about the industry, and these are issues that they do absolutely want to see addressed. The second key point about policymakers' views is we found a slight tension over the framing of ownership of certain policy areas and actions, which are very important. But the point there is around how you communicate, how the industry communicates what it's doing with some of these key policy issues. So this has a lot on it, so I'll explain a little bit. We asked in the interviews for policymakers to talk about some different policy areas and the role they see the industry has in working with them on those or not. And as you can see, these in blue were spontaneous areas that they brought up, which includes diversity and inclusion, support for consumers and SMEs going forward, and the fact you have such a strong role supporting the strong national economy. And these come up as being areas that there's a sense that the industry really owns, that you own and you drive forward. Some of these other areas are very important, such as moving forward in COVID-19 recovery, green finance, innovation and technology. But they're areas where policymakers really want to collaborate and come together. They want to learn from the expertise of the industry, but they want it to be framed as often areas that they are actually owning as a policy area, but working with you to be supported to drive forward. And there's a few more examples here I'll bring to life. COVID-19 recovery. Now, this was an interesting area to discuss in the research. And we tested some narratives as well with the policymakers that we interviewed. And what they sometimes felt a little concerned about was the sense that the industry could be seen to be trying to take credit for the support it offered. They thought the support that had been offered was invaluable, was incredible. It's part of what's driven an enhanced reputation for the industry. But they feel that the government very much played a strong role in putting that in place, and the industry worked with them to deliver that. And that's the type of framing that works really well in communicating the value of the industry, in working together and achieving these greater goals. And actually, interestingly, the public backed that up in the polling that we looked at, whereby they felt the government had really stepped in to support people, much more so than they felt the industry had done so, although they could recognise some measures the industry had done. So it's not to say that the way the industry stepped up to support people through the pandemic is not valued. It is absolutely valued. But the framing of how they work together with government is important in communicating these types of values. Green finance is another area that came up. And you can see from some of these quotes here, there's a sense that policymakers really want to understand green finance more and what can be done to drive forward bold initiatives. And that certain policy areas, such as the path to net zero, may be owned within a policymaker remit, but there's much that can be done in working together to drive that forward. And that, again, is the types of narrative and framing that they want to hear about. And similarly, the final point was in talking about the economy, a huge value the industry provides, and you should definitely be talking about that. But just being careful, again, in framing the details of the way in which the industry supports the economy provides a real storytelling narrative that feels authentic and isn't just a sort of business as usual outcome. So a range of policy areas that policymakers really feel they can work with the industry on that could continue to enhance the reputation of the industry if got right. So just to finish up, what does all this mean for communicating to policymakers and to driving trust? Because for the City UK, that's obviously a very important question. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it is a pivotal moment in thinking about what comes next and avoiding those potential pitfalls and snakes. So there was 3 key elements that emerged from talking to policymakers and showing them some messages. The first we would recommend is that communications should really aim to connect policy areas back to the strong economy that is perceived to be one of the main values of the industry. And really talking about the FRPS industry as an engine for growth and a magnet for investment, these types of statements work really well in doing that. The second key recommendation in thinking about how to effectively collaborate, talk to and communicate with the policymaker audience is absolutely to put yourself in your audience's shoes, which is always the recommendation we make in any campaign work that we're thinking about. So that's where we mentioned the notion of collaboration and working together is really important. So it doesn't appear to be there are separate entities working in separate ways, but actually together you're stronger, working together for common goals. And third, it's about evidencing statements with specifics that are really appealing to individual standpoints. Because the other thing we found in talking to policymakers is, of course, they have many of their own particular areas of interest. Be that for some innovation, for others diversity and equality, for others expanding more regionally, for others thinking about COVID recovery. There are many different areas they're really interested in that they want to hear more about, but they want to do so in a way that really tells the story and makes sense to them to connect what the industry is actually doing back to their interests. So that's a run-through of our research, and I'm going to now have a few questions.
Thanks so much, Carol. I think that's given us some great insights into what the public and policymakers actually think, because I think all too often we base some of the things that we assume policymakers think on perhaps some of the conversations that we have, which is one way of doing it. But I think the work that you've done has helped us refine some of the messaging that we already had, tweak the messaging slightly and the strategy. Carol, BritainThinks has been working with us at the City UK since 2014, a really long time, and I think some of the things that you've set out there are very positive, but I'd be really interested in your perspective over that longer period, over those 7 years. Has there been a change in sentiment? We've had a lot going on in that time. We've had several general elections, we've had a European referendum, we've had Brexit, we've had the pandemic. Gosh, it's been a busy time. I'd just be interested to hear more of a sort of historical perspective in recent history.
Absolutely. So I actually have gone through all of our reports over the years, and it's always quite striking to do so, to see what changes and what endures. There are some enduring aspects, the value that the industry brings to the economy, jobs, these types of things came through consistently every year. Perhaps unsurprisingly, a lot of the focus of research on reputation and what was coming next focused on Brexit for many years. The irony then, when I look back over the 2019 report, is that The message then was the industry is resilient, it will get through Brexit, it will be fine, and we all did not know what was coming on the horizon of a global pandemic. But I guess the message this year has also been, in 2021, the industry has been resilient and has come through that unexpected next stage. So if there is a consistent message, it's one of resilience, despite some definite surprises in what we saw. But I think the most compelling change I've seen is when I look back at some of the reports from other years and the findings we have, green finance and sustainability is conspicuous by its absence, whereas now that was really quite a core aspect of the themes policymakers were talking to us as being important for the future. And I think we shouldn't forget, over what is actually a relatively small timescale, just how much our awareness and perceptions of the importance of addressing climate change and ways to do so has moved on.
And what about diversity inclusion? It's interesting what you said about the spontaneous association of the industry with that agenda. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think that comes down to a sense that that is something the industry can own, and that, like, as many industries are grappling with at the moment, the points that we've made this morning already, it makes business sense in a world that is sort of diversifying to make sure you have different voices, you have different skill sets, you bring in different perceptions, and that is something that policymakers really feel the industry is beginning to do, but could do even more, as many industries could. But they also feel that is something that has to be done, that is kind of led and spearheaded by industries themselves. So it's a remit of the industry to think what is right for them, how do they do that, and how do they drive that forward for those benefits to business and innovation in the future.
One of your most striking slides is that word bubble.
Everyone loves the word cloud. Yeah.
Indeed, the word cloud. And I think what was so striking about that was the difference between public perception and policy-making perception, and that the policy-making perception is much more positive. And the word that sticks in my mind in a negative way from the public word cloud was greedy, whereas successful and some of the much more positive words from the policymakers' side. I just wanted to ask you a broader question. You do work for lots of different organisations. Is it often the case that there's some disconnect between what the public think and what policymakers think? And I suppose the thing that we've got to ask ourselves is, what do we do about that gap? Because in a way, it's good that policymakers are relatively positive about the industry, but obviously we need to make sure that there isn't that disconnect in future.
Yeah, and as I mentioned in the presentation, it's perhaps a bit of a hypothesis, but the more I talk to the public and do a lot of research, often perhaps with vulnerable audience, for example, work with the regulator very regularly, it is the fact that the vast majority of people are not that engaged in their finances. We can talk that maybe we should do more to engage them, but they're not. They don't know people that work in finance. So as I said, I think some of that disconnect perhaps comes from that, and where do they learn about the industry and what they might say about the industry, if not through sort of popular cultural and cultural stereotypes of the greedy banker, the fat cat bankers that you see in headlines. And it's difficult then to move away from that. I don't actually think that is what they feel or think when you then talk to them about the nuances of the actual services they interact with. So I think to some extent that disconnect is a bit of a false disconnect anyway, but that people's experiences talk louder than words. So there was a point there about MPs will understand their constituents' issues. So if their constituents have a negative experience of interacting with services and products, that's an actual experience they will talk about. They're probably not going in complaining about fat cat bankers, because that's actually kind of a cultural trope that is quite meaningless. But if they're able to access the right types of services and support that they need, I think that is how continued enhanced reputation and trust be driven. But as we saw by the figures of trust and reputation for people's own banks, I don't think the industry is doing too badly anyway in that regards.
Well, that's really, really positive. I wondered whether anybody had any questions in the audience. Yeah, got one here. Hold on a minute, Nick. We'll just get you a microphone.
I'm interested in that first graph you put up, which was about the sort of the trust and reputation piece growing, but they were still very low numbers, sort of 20-25%. Do you have any sense of how we would stack up against other countries? Is that typical, or are there other countries that are doing a better job, and are there any learnings that we could take from them?
That's a really good question. There are some trust barometers. I'm afraid I don't have the stats off the top of my head on that, but I do think from what I've seen, unfortunately in many countries, the tropes of the banking industry of being a little bit mistrusted remain. it's almost like a sector that gets tarred with that brush quite often. And I think the other industries that you see a lot of that now is things such as tech and social media. And so you're there now also, I think often grappling with how to enhance their reputation. I think through the pandemic, industries on a global scale, such as those providing, well, I mean, banks did provide essential services, but those in retail and food and drink, for example, you saw their sort of trust and favorability in them rising. You saw it to some extent in the financial services sector. But I think finance and tech do suffer from those cultural tropes that are not actually based in reality. And when people do understand how the systems work, they have a more positive view. And I think that is often found globally from what I've seen.
That's really interesting you asked that question, because we were discussing this research in our public affairs group, and one of our members said, what is the height of our ambition? Because as you say, the direction of travel is good, but the overall figures aren't that high. But any other questions on this? One over here, please.
Hi, thanks. Julian Wells from Whitecap Consulting. I was wondering, one of the things that struck me, as well as the word cloud, which I thought was the same word that stood out to me, was the point around industry not trying to take credit where it shouldn't do for initiatives. And I guess the headlines that you put up were probably, they were industry level rather than organisation level. Is it more a message for say, organisations like TheCityUK or representative groups, or is that for the companies themselves as well?
I think that's a good question. I think it is at a sector-wide level, but as we always say in communications, it's the framing that really matters as well. So we're absolutely not saying that firms or the industry as a whole shouldn't talk about the great support that was put in place in the pandemic or other great initiatives that they've done, but the framing of it is what's really important. And I'd say that message probably applies across the board, whether it's at an individual level or not, in thinking just really carefully about how that message is transmitted to the audience, and whether a simple tweak of we did this versus we did this and supported, to support the government can make all the difference to how it's received depending on your audience, if that helps answer your question.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. I think that was one of the things that most struck us about the research that you did. We went into the research having these sort of key messages about how the industry kind of led the way during the recovery, and what came back was that's not how policymakers see it. They see it as a supportive role, and that it lands better if you phrase it differently. And it's not necessarily saying something, as you say, completely different, but framing it in a different way. Do I have any final questions from the audience? Anybody looking inquisitive? I think that's been a really useful piece of research for us to do, because as I've said, we in public affairs in particular, we like to think we know politicians really well and the government, and actually it's been not only useful in terms of the policymakers but the public in terms of what they think. And I think we do need to work on that disconnect between the public sentiment and the policymaker sentiment. A couple of last questions from me, really. Really interested in this disconnect between what is a positive thing about the public and policymakers, particularly the public, seeing the industry as having a very, very constructive role in the national economy, but not so much in their local area or in their own lives. And is that something that's been consistent over the years that we've been asking you to do this research?
Yes, it has been, and it may even be that it's slightly changing. When I looked at the regional differences for this year, for example, actually the sense of confidence people have and of the ability that the industry has to support their local area, whilst as we saw was much higher in London, it is also higher in the south generally. So the story a bit more is the spread of the north-south divide, where people feel most disassociated and disconnected in the devolved nations in the north. So I think there are some improvements potentially in people's feeling how it supports them regionally, but those in the north and devolved nations, it's still more, there's more to be done in addressing those.
And overall, given the conversations that you and your team had this summer, we should be sort of confident but not complacent. And as you say, this is a pivotal moment. What would your advice be? I really like the slide that said, this is what you should do next. Maybe a final word about that would be really
I think there are challenges ahead, and COP26 may have slightly reframed things too. Green finance, sustainability was coming through in the research already. I think that's sentiment of the importance the sector has and the industry will have in driving that forward has only been enhanced. And actually, we're also seeing that from consumers and a real openness and warmth to, for example, sustainable funds in their pensions. So I did a recent poll where 30% of the population, so 1 in 3, said they would rather have a sustainable pension fund that didn't perform as well as a standard fund. And that was 25% of those aged over 45. So it was slightly higher for younger people, but it's absolutely across the population. I think there's a real openness amongst the general public and a desire to do something. They don't know what to do. And actually, being able to look at their finances doesn't change their life. Getting a new boiler is really difficult. But actually, having a pension you don't particularly understand, whether it's a sustainable one, it then gives you a halo effect. Like, but at least I'm doing something good. I still don't know what's going to happen in the end, but I've done something good. So I think there's a real appetite amongst the public to see how they can engage with that agenda. And that is going to be a really important agenda going forward. And I think will help in thinking about those reputational moments, because it is sort of overtaking all other themes that we see. Second, also, though, to supporting communities and the economy as we move out of the pandemic, and often support for SMEs and small businesses, for example. That's another thing that sort of goes down very well in terms of building reputation. But I think we just cannot ignore climate change and the impact it's going to have. And I see the public are almost ahead in their openness to wanting to do something than sometimes the people who are in the position of power to make it happen in their attitudes.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much, Carol. I think that's given us a lot of food for thought and some really invaluable insights into what policymakers and the public are thinking. And I think it's given us a broader kind of piece of research to set out our strategy and our messaging against. And as I've said, for the City UK, this is a key strategic priority for us, improving the trust and reputation of the industry. And I think it's true to say that we're on an ongoing journey, but we're at a good point in that journey, I think. It's been a difficult journey since 2010 when the City UK was created, but I think we've got a lot to build upon. And I think with the insight that you've given us, we can refine our messages and refine our strategy and hopefully make a real positive impact going forward on behalf of our members. So thank you, Carol, so much, and thank you to BritainThinks, and congratulations again on being Agency of the Year. And thanks to our audience here and online. And back over to you, Miles. Thank you.